no fun to follow Dave Benetti for a number of reasons, but one, he's such a great presenter. Hi, I'm really glad to be here at this event. I'm going to start at a kind of unlikely place. I'm going to start by telling you about our lease for our office space. About 2 years ago, I formed a nonprofit called Code for America. So as it is with most nonprofits, you can show the slide of our office space here. It was just me for a long time, so I worked out of my dining room. But middle of last year, we got enough funding that we could hire a very small staff. And then we realized that in January of this year, we were going to have 20 fellows join us all at once. And we needed to find a place for them to be. That's our model, by the way. We recruit fellows from across the country to come work with us on city governments. And we didn't have very much money. And in the middle of the search for office space that we could afford, a friend of mine who worked for a company called Moto Development Group told me that her company was being bought by a big giant in the tech industry, Cisco Systems. If you can move back a little, that'd be great. Moto was being bought by Cisco because they had it wasn't very public, but they had worked on the flip camera. They'd been one of the companies that had worked on that. And Cisco had bought Pure Digital, so they bought Flip, and they had decided that they were going to have a big consumer products division, and they bought Moto really as a talent acquisition. These were guys that were great on design and development of consumer products, like the Flip, and so they were going to do this great thing. So I found out that all the people from Moto were moving into Cisco's office space, and this space was going to be free. And I kind of realized, I'd sort of long since realized that when you're the director of a nonprofit, what you do is like professional begging. And so I started begging the people at Cisco to let us have that space for free, because I knew they didn't really have anything to do with it. And about 25 meetings and phone calls later, they did give us this space, and it's been wonderful. We have 5,000 square feet at the corner of 2nd and Market, 2nd and Mission in the city. It's fantastic. We moved in January. Great story for us. But the epilogue to that story is that Cisco bought all these guys, and in April of this year, they closed down the entire consumer products division and fired all the guys that had worked in this space that we were now occupying. I felt really bad because they had nowhere to go. We were in their space. So why did they do that? That's such a short time frame, right? Well, they had built this consumer product division around this product, and in the meantime, if you can go to the next slide, everybody had gotten an iPhone or an Android phone that did video. Nobody needed a flip camera. So this is not news to us. We know this. This is basically a story, but one that was very personal for me. I knew a lot of the people, about the pace of consumer technology in our society. So it's basically about Moore's Law. But it's not just Moore's Law. If you can put that next slide up, that'd be great. It took 50 years for the telephone to reach a quarter of US households, and it took the web a couple of years. So it's not just that technology is moving faster, it's the rate of technology is moving faster. And that's the context that we all live in, right? But there are certain things that are very much in our context that don't move at that rate, that are fixed. Not just fixed in their rate of change, but actually fixed. So one of those things is technology procurement for government. It takes 2 years to procure technology for the government. Okay, 2 years. So it's a little shorter in city governments for smaller projects. They can do things a little bit quicker. In federal government, it can take much longer than that, frankly. But basically the average and sort of the standard is about 2 years. So if we live in a world where Cisco can build an entire division and shut it down in about 7 months, the technology the government buys is by definition hugely outdated by the time they buy it. Okay? So this is the context that we work in. If I could get the next slide, that'd be great. So not only is there a gap then, there's a gap that's getting wider and wider by the day, basically, because Moore's Law is not this sort of standard thing. It's this crazy curve, right? That's the hockey stick curve. So every month that goes by, the gap between consumer technology and government technology gets wider and wider, to the point where, as my friend Clay Johnson likes to say, eventually the government is driving Buicks and we're in flying cars. So obviously, the government has flying cars, the military has flying cars, but they're paying $2 billion for the flying car, and when we're able to buy the flying car for the cost of the Toyota, they'll still be paying $2 billion, right? So this is a problem This is a real problem. It's a problem for our relationship with government. If I could have the next slide. But the point is, what do you do about it? So we can protest. We can talk about it. We can create a media campaign around it. You can all call your congressman and talk about it. But that's essentially a political solution to a governmental problem. And I think the first point I'd really like you guys to take away from this is that politics and government are very closely related, but they are two essentially separate things. The system that gets people elected, as David was just talking about, is an important system, and it's an important input into an important system. But the system that actually governs our daily lives, that spends our taxpayer money, is a related but separate system. Okay? So if we don't get that, okay, we're a little bit ahead of ourselves. If we don't get that, we have a fundamental disconnect in how we're dealing with this system. So if I can make an example here, I'm not a technologist, I'm not a developer, and I hate making analogies to technology, but I'm just going to do it, and forgive me if it's a terrible one. But if government were a software program, we would be like the largest, most bloated operating system ever. And we would think that by changing the font on one of the interface screens, that we're making a difference to the code. The code's not going to run any faster. And that change, by the way, is always serif to sans serif, right? That's the modern thing. We made it a sans serif font. The code doesn't run any faster. We have a real problem with the system here. We think that the political layer is our input to the system, but the system is very large, and it sits below, the system of bureaucracy sits below the political system, and it's a very different system. So politics is not the same as the government, and the people that we work so hard to elect, they find that out when they get into office. They can't make the changes they promised to us. Does this sound familiar to anybody? They actually can't, and one of the reasons they can't is, go to the next slide, please. No, forward, thank you. So this is from Yes Minister. It's a UK like sitcom about the UK government. So their motto there is, it's a fundamental principle that electeds not actually be allowed to make decisions. That's the staff's job. So there's this difference between the electeds and the staff. But it's not just the staff. There's a huge number of laws and regulations that keep the staff from being able to be as agile and creative as we are in the private sector. And that's a really difficult piece of that. If I could have the next slide. So the difference between politics and government is a really important point to make. But what you have to understand is that protest is still an important part of this. So I grew up late 80s, living in New York City. When I was in high school, I went out, I protested against nukes. When I went to college, I went and did sit-ins for, against apartheid. This continued off and on until I was 33. I was 8.5 months pregnant, and the Iraq War started, and I decided to go to the intersection of Market and Stockton and get arrested. Which, by the way, if you ever want to get arrested, do it pregnant. They're great to you. They kept me for about 10 seconds, released me right away. And they asked me the whole time, are you okay, are you okay? It's just a wonderful way to get treated. Everyone else was in there for like hours. They got me out instantly. Protest is still an important part of it. I believe very strongly in protest. I believe in elections. I believe in the political process. But I think it's essentially an insufficient, as David said, it's an insufficient input into a very deep and complex system. And I'm worried. I'm worried that if we confuse these two, if we don't understand the differences, then we spend a lot of time on amplifying our voices. So it's very important that some of the tools that are being built that better represent the will of the people to the electeds. I think those are fantastic. But we have to understand that if we all amplify our voices, we're basically all shouting louder and louder about a decreasing pie, right? We're all fighting for a slice of the pie that's getting smaller. We live in a country with enormous resources. We could probably do anything we want. If government is the way that we do things collectively that we can't do individually, we could actually do an enormous amount. But we're wasting a lot of that money. We're working with a much smaller pie than we need to because we've crippled our government. If I could have the next slide. Oh. So essentially, my thesis here is that voting and political action is not a sufficient input into a very vast and complex system. So that's a disturbing thought, I think, for many people. But hopefully it makes you think a little bit. Here's a further disturbing thought. What if political action actually sometimes made the problem worse? Right? So political action generally results in laws and regulations. Those laws and regulations are really about what we call the how of government. And too often, what they are designed to do is very narrowly constrain that how. We want to be focused on the what. What do we collectively want to do as society? How do we want to spend more money? Do we want to help the poor? Do we want to have foreign policies that we all agree on, or that the majority of people agree on, that it reflect a just society? Well, when we write laws that are very constrained, that's when we end up things with two-year procurement policies that cripple us, right? You can think of other examples. Hiring practices that really punish people who want to serve their country. It's very hard to be a public servant. I don't know how many of you actually know somebody who works in federal, state, or local government. They have terrible jobs. They actually work really, really hard, and it's very hard for them to get anything done. Things like records management acts that make it impossible for city governments or other levels of government to actually use social media. These are laws that were written with the best of intentions. They were often intended to fight corruption, which I think we can all agree is something you want to fight. But when we get very detailed about the how of government through legislation, we're using the wrong tools for the right means. We're trying to do the right thing, but legislation's the wrong way to do it. And so we need to really, again, think about that definition, that distinction between the political level and the bureaucratic level. I started out by saying we're talking about office space. That's not sexy. Bureaucracy isn't sexy. Politics is a lot sexier. We need to pay more attention to it. Next slide. So one further disturbing thought. We think a lot about how the political system can be gamed. The bureaucratic system is hugely gamed, and we need to pay more attention to that as well. Vivek Kundra was the federal CIO. He came in, he did 2 years, he left in July. He's just really a true patriot. I really admire his work. He wrote a fabulous piece called Reflections on Public Service. It's the first return if you Google that. It's a great piece. If you're interested in government role, I would definitely encourage you to read it. But he talked about how in an era of decreasing budgets, the idea that you throw more government resources at this problem is exactly the wrong idea, because we essentially have an IT cartel that benefits not because they give better technology, but because they know how to game the system. They know how to use procurement. So we have to think about this when we're thinking about our government. We have to consider we have to consider what's really happening there. Next slide, please. So I've talked about, I want to talk a little bit more about Vivek. So Vivek came in and he basically said, instead of putting more resources on this, I'm going to cut resources. I'm going to look at all the programs, the IT programs in the federal government that are over budget, overdue, and not really doing anything for citizens or government. I'm going to cut them. That's not what you think of people really doing when they go into government. Usually they're trying to get more resources, create more of an empire. He was like, cut, cut, cut. And I'm a big fan of that. So when you hear that and you hear about my history of protest, I just want to address that I feel like you can hear that and you can say, this is a story I already know. You're looking at a woman in her early 40s who was very liberal when she was young and is becoming more conservative, wants to cut government. That's not the right story. Please don't go home with that, okay? I've been working in government now. I had never had a background in government before. I've been working in government for about 2 years now. And now I go to the drugstore and I take a new drug off the shelf. And I'm very aware now when I take that off that I'm going to take those pills. And I don't think they're going to kill me. And that's because the FDA has a process for actually reviewing drugs that go to market, right? Now, we can all talk about how they maybe should have a faster review process. That's fine. But I want to live in a society where the FDA has a role. I also fly a lot, so I'm really glad that we regulate airlines. I don't want to die in an airplane. Stephen Johnson, great author, came to speak to our group recently, and he talked about something that nobody ever talks about. So it's been over 4 years since we've had a fatality in a commercial airliner in the United States. That's not true anywhere else in the world. This isn't going to make any headline. And when we think about the plane that landed on the Hudson, we think about a fantastic, wonderful pilot, and I think that's great. I mean, Sully deserves a lot of credit. But what we don't frame that story as is a huge triumph of regulation and government. And it is. We have really gotten good at regulating the airline industry so people aren't dying. I truly believe that government is a force for good in our society. It's something I hugely value. So when I talk about cutting government, I'm talking about it from the perspective of someone who truly values it. So the frame I came from when I was protesting, and maybe I'm not currently, but I would if I had time, is a frame of exit or voice. This guy, his name is Alfred Hirschman. He wrote about this concept. He's actually originally from Europe. The concept came from Europe. It's the idea, basically, that when you encounter a problem in a system, you have two options. You can complain about it and get other people upset about it, or you can leave the system that you're in. And that can be as a consumer or as a citizen. There's a particularly American expression of this idea because we've always had that place to exit to. We had a frontier. California is that frontier. A lot of us came here because of that history and the value that California has that way. And I think most recently, our exit has been to the internet, right? We want to believe that the people who share our values are our friends on the internet, our internet tribes. We kind of exit from our neighborhoods, our city, our state, our federal government into that community. That's sort of an aside. But that's the frame that I grew up with. You can leave or you can protest. Now, I said that I think politics is an insufficient mechanism to changing government, but I actually have a huge amount of optimism about our ability to make our government reflect our own values. And that's because we have these 20 fellows who've come to work with us for the year. They have come from all the way across the country in many cases. They have left their often way more lucrative jobs. They're taking a year out of their careers. They're often leaving loved ones. They work for a very small stipend. They've come to work for Code for America for the year. It is not sexy work. They're not working at a startup or Facebook or Google. They're working with City Hall. And they're doing that because I think they don't think about exit or voice and reject them. They've never thought that way. They think about systems that they've encountered as if they've grown up, right? Every system that's come their way is something they've been able to hack. Maybe it was an Atari or media that they always had a voice in. They were able to open up the hood and make it better. And so they hit the age where they're getting their first paycheck, and they see that 40% of it is going to the government, and they go, that's not optimal. I'll fix it. They're not rejecting exit or voice. They're just saying, that's not my approach. My approach is, I will optimize this system. I will hack it. I will fix it. And that's the thing that makes me so optimistic about the future of government and the future of politics. If I could have the next slide. What they're really about isn't that. It's to get it excited and make things, right? We all love this one. So they're making a lot of great things. Let's be honest, though. We have 20 people. We just started out. They're making small things, very small things. And in our movement, we're part of a bigger movement of people who are trying to reform government or trying to show what's possible. And there isn't a city out there, we work at the city level, there isn't a city out there right now that is whole hog going, completely transparent, engaging the majority of its citizens and finding enormous cost savings in the process. I wish there were, but there are not. There are small stories of success where people are doing hugely efficient and transparent things that really make a city better, but they're small stories. But the point about small stories is they have incredible power. That's what events like this are. But I want to share one story of small stories with you, and that's from the Checklist Manifesto. I hope a lot of you have heard of this. So Atul Gawande wrote a book about how a checklist, a very small, non-technical thing, had a huge impact. One of the stories he talks about is this thing about a central line infection, right? So in hospitals around the country, they implemented a checklist that took the infection rates of central lines from about 18% down to almost zero immediately. So it was previously accepted that you always had a 15 to 18% infection rate when you put a central line into somebody. Just accepted. Nobody challenged it. They put this checklist in those hospitals, you had this enormous impact. But what's not often talked about is that there are also hospitals where the checklist wasn't implemented, but they were nearby hospitals where it was. In those hospitals and surrounding areas that didn't implement it, the rate also dropped. Not to zero, but dramatically, noticeably. So why did that happen? Because the concept that that was an intractable problem and acceptable was challenged. People talk. It became seen, primarily by nurses, as a solvable problem. And that's the business that we're in right now. It's making intractable problems seem solvable. And it's also about making things that haven't been seen before seem possible. So that's what we do. Take the next slide. And that's also what I would ask you guys to do. So Christina started with this. Does anyone want to try to read binary? I don't read binary. This says, in binary, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, right? Our union is hugely imperfect. But everyone's job here, if you want to support the work we're doing, is to believe that the problems of government that we've all accepted as intractable and insolvable are actually solvable. And to support the people who are taking time out of their year, time out of their careers to go do this and try to fix this problem, support them. They, our fellows, I think, and other people are really the true heroes of the Gov2O movement. So thank you very much. Appreciate your help.